Nick Norwitt's PhD and soon to be MD, has one of the fastest growing science-based health explainer channels on YouTube, where he breaks down metabolism science and ties it into practical health strategies. Here, Nick and I get into a long conversation about Bryan Johnson's protocol, and I ask his expert opinion on some of the things that I thought didn't add up about his story.
This is the man spending millions to live forever.
I am the healthiest person on planet Earth.
Yeah, let me just say what my overall objective here is, or within the message I'd like to get to Bryan. And I think we're kind of aligned here, which is that I actually really like him and like his long form. I've listened to a lot of his content. First on Trevor Noah, that was my first exposure to him in long form. Diary of a CEO, More Plates, More Dates. And I find his philosophy very compelling. The way he articulates himself around the don't die movement, I find quite compelling. So I'm not a naysayer to that approach. Personally, I don't want to die. I love the idea of extreme human longevity blending with AI. And some of the things he says about like the specificity of this day and age and us being on the cusp of like maybe having that opportunity to live forever and challenging social norms around, what has been considered, normal for humanity based on the technology and science we've had. I like that. So my objective is not to be a troll by any means, but to provide constructive criticism, what I think are constructive criticisms, to him as a communicator of this mission in order to amplify his impact. I think some of the things he's been saying, maybe it's just not great optics, or a little bit of shaky science. And I can give constructive examples that he might actually like about marketing his ideas with more rigorous physiology. So that's the high level. Like I don't have a direct line to him. Otherwise I just call him on the phone, but we don't have that. So we'll end up having a conversation and see how he responds. I know you've had a back and forth with him, so I'll pass it back to you and let's have a conversation about it.
Sure. Yeah. It wasn't really much of a conversation or a back and forth. Basically, I criticized the observational studies he used, and then he had it was a funny zinger of kind of, I don't know if it was a zinger, but it was like a funny comment saying this is brought to you by the Hot Dog Association, and then that was pretty much it. And then he did write a response to some of the critics who were criticizing his justification for not eating meat, but then it was clearly kind of a response to me, but like not directly saying it was to me.
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of where it was. And yeah, I do agree with you in terms of like, there's a ton of stuff he's doing right, and there's a ton of stuff he's doing or messaging that he's getting across that seems to be helping people. And so I think, he is helping a lot of people, especially making this idea of like, let's get healthy, but he's making it a lot more sexy and a lot more fun, and people seem to jive with it a lot more, and he's getting people excited about longevity and all that. So there's plenty that's great about him. It's just, as you say, there's certain things, certain grandiose marketing claims that I think are kind of taking him off, that are misleading people, essentially. Like, right. Yeah, so it sounded like you might have had one in specific you wanted to address.
Sure, I can give examples. I think first thing to comment on, and a lot of this might be like optics. You might have more thorough, thoughts behind the scenes that don't get communicated for whatever reason. But let's take the example that you just brought up of the whole red meat thing. You put something out and he responds with a quip, which is fine. Like I realize sometimes it's appropriate to make a joke, or that can be, a fine style. But he tends to lean in a little bit more when someone makes a comment who just has a bigger profile and he feels he needs to defend himself. So there was this drama between him and Andrew Huberman when Andrew commented, friends don't let friends do partial reps. And Bryan, the first time I've ever seen him go like viciously after Andrew over what I thought was like a pretty light, friendly quip, and so when you come at him, with a, let's say, scientific challenge, or actually I jumped in on that thread. I don't know if it was that exact thread, but around the red meat comment, because he was having a back and forth with Dave. And I'm like, look, I understand you hedging your bets based on the observational data, but let's have, a serious assessment of the literature here. I'm not going to ask you to write an encyclopedic response. answer me one question, which is, what is the most compelling mechanism by which red meat should be bad for longevity? Because when I read these papers, I do read all these papers, I look at, okay, what is being said by the observational study, and then what is like the compelling physiology underneath it. And sometimes when you go digging, you realize that it's actually really shaky science, and it almost seems like a narrative is being forcefully built in order to promote, status quo ideas. I'll give you an example. Earlier this year, so we're recording this, February 17th, 2025. I think it was February or January of 2025. There was an article in Neurology. It was a large observational study about red meat and dementia. Now, it fits with his confirmation bias that, red meat is bad for like cognitive longevity. You look at it and you could say, all right, well, it's an observational study. There's a lot of healthy user bias, which there was. Actually, unprocessed red meat had no association with cognitive decline. It was just the processed red meat. But that's not even what I want to highlight. To the biological plausibility point, there's a comment in the discussion saying, well, saturated fat, which isn't specific to unprocessed red meat versus processed, so that's a problem, but let's just roll with it. Saturated fat decreases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And I'm sure Bryan knows BDNF, is important for brain health. Now, the reference that they cited for this biological plausibility was a mouse study where the mice were eating an HFS diet. Do you want to guess what HFS stands for? You want to read my mind. High-fat sucrose diet.
Okay.
So this is a paper published in Neurology that are observational data without any good biological plausibility. They start hand-waving about biological plausibility, and to throw saturated fat under the bus, they reference a mouse study, I think it was reference 34, where the mice were eating a high-fat sucrose diet. Right. So I'm not saying that you need to eat red meat for the brain, but I'm saying if you're going to go out of your way to make a claim about why you don't eat red meat, you kind of need to be armed with an understanding of the literature. And that's just one example of where Bryan didn't step up to defend his position based on the physiology. And it does seem to become a pattern, especially when he's on, podcasts citing studies that he clearly doesn't know much about. Like there was the olive oil example.
Right.
Had this study he talked about where olive oil led to weight loss, and he misspoke on a couple of occasions. He claimed that he misspoke. Derek on More Plates, More Dates called him out on it respectfully. And it was interesting to see him grapple with that pushback because he wasn't like entirely defensive. Like he admitted he made a mistake with respect to the science. However, then he kind of passed the buck off to his team, which is like this ephemeral group of people who aren't really communicating directly with the public. And honestly, I'm a little bit skeptical because I actually see a lot of not great side. I actually, hopefully I won't get anybody in trouble for saying this, but I've actually had the opportunity to see some of the back end stuff produced by his team. In one instance, I was asked to review it. I'm not going to say what the topic is. People can take my word for it. They cannot. But I reviewed the content and I ripped it apart. They never ended up publishing that content. So I've seen some of the things his team's produced. I'm not always confident in it. I understand it's like, their IP, which is a little bit odd since they said the objective of Blueprint was never to make money. So you think they'd be as transparent as possible in terms of like, publishing their methodology, even if it took a bite out of their bottom line. To be clear, I have nothing, against them making a business out of it. I think it's fine to commercialize. But when your optics are around scientific rigor and you're passing the buck to your team for scientific rigor and then not revealing the details of your methodology and not having your team step up to defend the protocol, really, I think that's just not great optics.
Yeah, there was definitely in that interview, there was several times where he was basically trying to take the stance of, well, I'm not the expert. You're going to have to ask the team on that. So you have these kind of two different sides of Bryan, where on the Diary of the CEO podcast, he's willing to be like, here is how olive oil works. Here's why it's amazing. Here's how it basically induces weight loss, like despite the fact that you're adding calories to the diet, or so he claimed. Right. But then when it comes to the More Plates, More Days podcast, he's very quickly like, oh, that, I'm not the expert. You have to consult my team. I rely on my team for these kind of decisions. And so
Right.
the thing though is it would have been one thing if he kind of like toned it down after the More Plates, More Dates podcast, because Derek did do a good job of challenging him a lot in that. And Bryan was very non-defensive. So it was kind of, you know, it looked good, but it didn't at the same time because he's basically saying, I'm not an expert, but he's very non-defensive. But then he's the next podcast that comes out, he's on Impulsive and he's saying, I have the best biomarkers on the planet. I am the healthiest person on the planet.
Yeah. Let me flex on Bryan and Bryan's team for a moment and give an example. Like I said, I could give concrete examples of what I'd like to see from him, which doesn't need to be super, like rigorous RCTs about longevity. You're never going to have that. But let's take the olive oil example, right? He's talking about the benefits of olive oil. He cites a study that he clearly doesn't know well. What I'd like to see from him is something more like, there was a paper out in Cell Metabolism recently. I think it was entitled Mitochondrial Calcium Uptake Declines During Aging, something about skeletal muscle performance. The people, if they want to look it up, I think it was Girardi was the first author. Mm-hmm. And basically, they describe this incredible mechanism by which a compound found in primarily olive leaves, but to some degree in the oil. I actually got the specs on Bryan's olive oil, and I know how much of the active compound was in it. But they did this hypothesis-naive screen for compounds, like there's 5,571 compounds that might enhance mitochondrial calcium import. Now, for important background, Bryan's all about longevity. There are elements of longevity. This has been backed up by other studies that can be offset by exercise. There are elements of aging that can be offset by exercise and some that can't. And one key one that just declines with age generally is mitochondrial calcium import. So people might know that calcium is really important for muscle contractions. When a nerve pulse hits a muscle, calcium influxes, and that allows the actin and myosin to kind of like overlap. That is a muscle contraction, but the body's smart and also couples calcium to energy production. So calcium can influx into mitochondria, basically activate the gateway, let's say, to the TCA cycle and enhance energy production. But mitochondrial calcium import declines with age, even if you exercise. So one might ask the question, is there a way we can offset this? And this is what the study was about. They found that oleiropine, which is found in olive leaf extract, can increase activity of the mitochondrial calcium uniporter complex, get more calcium into mitochondria, and that, at least preclinically, that increases endurance, exercise performance, and even increases muscle mass in an animal model. It's really interesting physiology. Bryan can go read that paper. I mentioned what it was, but I bring this up because that's the level of, look, I don't even consider myself a longevity expert. I am a PhD scientist with a broad range of interests and a medical student with not a lot of time on my hands, but I can still read that paper and articulate that physiology and try to explain it. Now, if his purpose is longevity and hardcore science, why isn't he or a member of his team digging into the physiology like that rather than presenting high-level data that he doesn't really understand? It's not good optics. If he could really get the best people in the world, I don't know why they wouldn't be covering data like that, because that's really compelling. And from a marketing point of view, think about it. Like, he's always talking about his olive oil. What if he could have oleiropine-rich olive oil, then lean into those data and say, my olive oil might actually help your muscular health. Here's a cell metabolism paper explaining it, and we're going to break it down for you. Like, he could make millions off of that paper alone if he marketed it well, if his team understood the science. I have a video coming out on this. I'm happy to share it with him. Like, I'm actually trying to be helpful here. Is like, that's what I want to see him step up and talk about. And I don't see that. I haven't seen scientific rigor or physiological rigor, I should say.
I think that's one of the big issues with his approach is his team is kind of shrouded in mystery. So in many of his videos, he's talking about like, we looked at all the science on longevity and then we created this product formulation. Or, my team looked at all the best clinical research or clinical interventions to determine the doses of our products. But then it's like, okay, who's the team? And then how did you do this best research that's better than everyone else? You were able to formulate a supplement line that was better than anything that has existed before. So how did you achieve that? Then, but as he explains in the More Plates, More Dates interview, that's IP, right? So it's like, I'm not going to tell you who my team is and what it is about their process that makes it superior. I can't talk about that because that's IP. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that
there's
a
other
fair?
ways you could go about doing this. So even if you didn't want to disclose, why his team doesn't need to be shrouded in mystery. Their identities need to be private. Like what we could do, like to promote myself or like anybody like me, I would like to sit down with his team. You can choose his, most elite members of his scientific board in a conversation. We can choose a range of topics, and I'd like to have a discussion and grill them a little bit and see how they actually understand the physiology and science. And you can
Yeah.
tell from a conversation like that if the team is actually expert and has actually done their due diligence of the literature just based on the quality of the discussion. Now, I
Mhm.
might not be the best person because I don't consider myself a longevity expert, but I can, I think, ask the right questions to probe if somebody knows what they're talking about or they're, a little bit hand wavy. And there's no reason I see that his team, his top scientists need to be shrouded in mystery. So I would, remove that veil if I were Bryan, if he can.
Right, right. If anything, it'd probably be good, very, very good for their career and stuff. So it should be an incentive to do it.
I know. Well,
Right.
provided they can step up and make a good performance, which I would hope. I'll give that the benefit of the doubt, but one has to ask why he wouldn't make the process more transparent if, it seems like it would be a win-win all around.
I think that this kind of ties a little bit into the I have the best comprehensive biomarkers in the world claim, because I would assume that it is based on his team's decision to say these are the set of biomarkers that are most important. You saw that, right? His big spreadsheet. And so
Yeah.
it was kind of like, how did you choose that those are necessarily the most important biomarkers? Did you have any thoughts on that spreadsheet?
Well, I really wanted to get into the spreadsheet to look at the references where they were determining like his percentiles.
Hmm.
My understanding is the spreadsheet is no longer publicly accessible. I couldn't get into it.
So
Um,
yeah, well, he has an
the screen,
image
so,
posted now. The screen cap is out. So, he hasn't.
yeah, that's fine. But like, there are like claims about I'm in the X percentile, and then there's like a hyperlink, and I'm like, I don't know where you're saying you're getting. So, for example, like his omega-3 index, I think was like 9.98%, and he said he was in the top percentile, I think.
Mhm.
I mean, my omega-3 index is 17.2. So if he's 9.98 and I'm 17.2 and he's in the top 1%, what am I? But I don't know what reference range he's using because I can't access, that's the references or things like telomere length. I mean, the length of your telomeres is, I mean, it's an interesting, I guess you could say, biomarker of aging is telomeres that do tend to shorten with age. But he's been doing this for what, 2 years, 3 years? I don't know how many years, but like not that much of a proportion of his overall life. So how did he increase his telomerase activity to the point that his telomeres presumably lengthened? Because I don't think, even if his telomeres didn't shorten at all over the past 3 years, probabilistically he wouldn't be in the top like percentile. So like what tests did he use and where is his reference range coming from? How is he determining his percentiles? Or he's like in the top whatever percentile of like fasting blood sugar. I'm like, what does that mean? It was like in the 70s. Like, what if I have a fasting blood sugar of 20? It's weird. And also things that just weren't included in the sheet. I don't know if the LH and FSH were ever revealed,
Nope.
but there was question about that because they're looking at his like testosterone level and trying to question if it's normal. So you want to see the feedback hormones. And LH and FSH are things he almost certainly has. I don't know why he wouldn't disclose them. I don't know why he wouldn't have a comprehensive thyroid panel, not just a TSH, especially when he's on thyroid medications. And there were other things that were just like, I don't know why you wouldn't disclose what I thought were pretty basic biomarkers. And also, like, I really want to know how you're coming up with these percentiles and making these claims because they're a little bit shady in my opinion. A little bit. I could be wrong, but that's why I want to see the reference range data.
Yeah, so it's funny. Just quick tangent. It's funny because, well, the sheet is no longer accessible, but in the omega-3 index and the telomere length, the two that you mentioned, he didn't even have a reference for the first place. So how he got top 5% deduced for either of those is unclear. And
Did it say top 5% for each one?
this is top 5% for each one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Not as extreme, but still, like, you'd want to know.
Yeah, right. Could you give us like a little bit? perspective, just kind of to fill the viewers in. So he has a testosterone of 976 nanograms per deciliter and a free testosterone of 17.4 nanograms per deciliter. In the context of everything else he's doing, he's 10% caloric restriction. He's got really low body temperature. His thyroid activity is apparently good, but he is taking thyroid medication, and we only see his TSH. We don't see T3, T4, any of these other things. And there's no LH or FSH on here, even though he said on another podcast that he has that data. Is there anything kind of like, can you give us some context about like why that's a little fishy?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're taking exogenous testosterone, it's going to feed back to the pituitary and then suppress the release of the hormones that would stimulate testosterone production by the testes. So that's why you want an LH and FSH, because if those are suppressed, it's suspicious that he's taking exogenous testosterone. So it's very easy. He could just disclose those. Now, they are, well, I won't get into the nitty gritty of like hormone pulsatility, but like he should have those data accessible. All that said, like it's plausible as testosterone is where it's at, even with the caloric restriction. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just like to confirm it, I don't know why you wouldn't release the regulatory hormones. I mean, my testosterone's in the around 1,000 or 1,100, and I'm like a stressed medical student with crappy sleep. But like testosterone 900 is good. It's healthy, provided it's natural. And given his protocol, his restriction, his low body temperature, questions about his thyroid, I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't a natural testosterone. But it's possible. But I like you could just like quell the doubt by releasing the LH and FSH. Or you could just say, actually, my testosterone runs lower because of caloric restriction. It's a zero-sum game. And on balance, we think this is better for my longevity to run a lower testosterone, lower body temperature, XYZ. That's fine. Be transparent. But like I wouldn't knock at that,
Right. Yeah. It's
trade-off on longevity science. So you don't need to have a testosterone of 900. If you had a testosterone of 500, like that doesn't mean he's unhealthy.
Yeah. I mean, he could. Yeah. I guess the other thing is like, well, we wouldn't even be discussing this if he just releases LH and FSH, which he has. If his team is really in the know, they would probably be able to predict immediately that people would be asking about it. So they would say, oh, we should release this data too. But, we're just kind of in the dark. I guess that's the issue. What do you think about? Sorry, go ahead.
One other thing before I forget, it was like I was listening, I forget which podcast it was on. I think it was Derek, but he had never gotten any cardiovascular imaging.
Oh, huh.
And if you're going to make like claims about your heart health, I mean, like you want at least a CAC or something. Like, I don't really care where your ApoB is, to be honest. Like, do you have plaque?
I think
rationale, I heard it. Like he was like, his team was like, my biomarkers are so good, I probably don't have cardiovascular progression. I don't want to expose myself to the radiation. Like the radiation exposure from a CAC. Now, I think a CCT will be better, but like it's something like 2 months of free living on Earth. And with all the travel he does, like I think it's a menial, and for public and optic purposes, he should get some cardiovascular imaging and disclose those results.
I think maybe that was an older one. At least on this spreadsheet, it does say he has a CAC score of 0.
Oh, okay. All right. Fair enough. I retract that comment.
Okay. Yeah. What do you think about this basal temperature thing? 93.4 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.01% of people.
Did he stick his head in an ice bath before? That's pretty cold. It's not something that I've seen clinically in normal healthy people. He's on an extreme protocol. I mean, generally, lower basal metabolic rate in organisms tends to associate with longer lifespan. So I guess that's the speculation. I don't know. I feel like I'd be pretty uncomfortable if my body temperature was running 93 or 93.8 or whatever. But I don't think it's a huge flex. I don't make too much of it. he's calorically restricted. I guess
Mhm.
his BMR has gone down. It kind of makes sense. But I wouldn't extrapolate to that from that. Oh, yeah, he's definitely going to live to 120. This is a great biomarker for longevity. It's just a number.
Okay. I saw this one argument written by allegedly a medical doctor. He didn't put his name, it was anonymous, but it was interesting, worth asking you about. And the person
Mhm.
was basically making the argument that Bryan is basically doing a protocol that is having his body simulate the symptoms of anorexia, is the way I would put it to say I'm not claiming he's anorexic. That's not what I'm claiming at all. But certain signs are similar to anorexia, or at least that's what this post was saying. So, for example, the super low body temperature,
Yeah.
the questionable thyroid things, and then the paleness of the skin, for example. He was saying that this is what happens, that Bryan's paleness wouldn't be explained only by lack of sunlight, that it's like, especially pale because the circulation is preserved towards the core, so you don't get as much of a glow in the skin. That was the argument. What do you think about that? Is that kind of just
I think it's trying to cast what he is intentionally doing in a negative light. And I don't know if it's entirely fair because
okay?
it's like, it's a spectrum, right? He is calorically restricting. Like that is a goal for him, which means he's going to trend towards that, let's say, caloric restriction phenotype. And it's a bit like walking a tightrope. Like if you don't eat enough, you're going to have negative consequences, which if we take his biomarkers at face value, he's not seeing. So, for example, in anorexia or something called like relative energy deprivation in sports, you see really low bone mass density.
Mm.
And osteopenia and osteoporosis can develop. So his bone mass density, I think, is like, let's take it at face value. We got a DEXA and it's very high. If he has high bone mass density and he's maintaining good muscle mass and a reasonable testosterone, and honestly, like he's just a vigorous person, which I think he is. He's in a brain, like, he gets up, he talks. Whether or not you thought his range of motion was complete on the leg press, like he's a strong guy. So I don't think it's fair to say he's like borderline anorexic. He's calorically restricting, but he's maintaining good biomarkers. Best on the planet, I don't know. His bone mass density is good. His musculature is good. You can see that by just looking at him. So I'll give that to him. No, I don't think that's a fair criticism.
Okay. The one of the extensions from that was that his sleep data might not necessarily be reflecting the full picture because basically, I think it was parasympathetic tone that this guy was, who was like, kind of, to be fair, overly critical of Bryan. He was saying like, well, it might be the case that he's just has like actually really lacking parasympathetic tone. And that is why the sleep tracker, the Whoop, is saying he has great sleep. So it's not necessarily that he has perfect sleep. Is that reaching too far too?
I think so, and it's one of these things where when you're providing criticisms to someone, I feel like focus on the good arguments. I don't think that's a good argument. Like I don't care if like his sleep score is really 100% every single night, or if it's like 99. Like he sleeps well. Like I'm not going to speculate about his parasympathetic tone when there are other things that I think deserve more focus. So I think it dilutes what are functional and constructive criticisms to speculate about things like that. So with the anorexia thing, the increased parasympathetic tone, maybe, but I don't even think it's that relevant, if that makes sense.
Okay, no, yeah, that's a great point. Okay, and then before we move on from the biomarkers, did you have any other comments on the thyroid? Because like we were saying, or like you were saying, that we only have the TSH, we haven't seen other things, and then he is taking levothyroxine and armor thyroid.
Yeah, not really. I mean, a TSH will tell you if you have appropriate thyroid levels. It's TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, so it stimulates your thyroid to release thyroid hormone. So you generally dose exogenous thyroid hormone, which I think he's on, in order to keep your TSH at a certain level. Um, zero point 0.5, which I think it was what it was, is at the lower end of things, which means I don't think he's overdosing his thyroid medication. But in the range you're trying to shoot for your TSH, it's actually interesting that he's, if that's a consistent level, pushing it towards the lower range because that means he's taking a little bit more thyroid hormone, which you wouldn't think he was trying to do if he's trying to slow his metabolic rate. which is just interesting. There's a lot of individual variability, but I would almost guess his thyroid, his TSH would be more like a 1.5 or a 2 rather than a 0.5. It would be interesting to get multiple time points and also know how much thyroid hormone he's dosing. The absence of like, a T4, T3, 3 levels of those hormones or a reverse, I don't think it's a huge deal. I'd like to see them. I know I'm not an endocrinologist by trade, so somebody else might be able to dig into that and come to other conclusions. And I think that should be fair game for like public speculation if he's doing this public N of one. So I presume he has a full thyroid panel. I think he should disclose it. However, all that said, his TSH of 0.5, I think, is pretty normal. I'd like to see more time points to see if he's consistently running 0.5 rather than running like a 1.5. And if he is consistently running a 0.5, I'd be interested to know his rationale for his current thyroid dosing and why he doesn't go down a tiny bit if his goal is longevity.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Well, one of the things I was thinking is like, well, in the context of trying to brag about this very low basal temperature, I would have thought like a more comprehensive thyroid panel, like revealing that, it would like kind of push the necessity of that or push the importance of that. Do you think that's fair to say? Like given this particular context, it would be worth a little bit more data on his thyroid.
I think it'd be interesting. People could speculate about why his body temperature is low. Again, I don't know that it's super meaningful. And to play devil's advocate in his favor, I think sometimes you can anticipate how people will run away with narratives and will create distracting narratives. So sometimes I think data that might not be meaningful in one's estimation could be kept quote unquote secret in order to not poke those trolls. It's a little bit of a slippery slope, admittedly, because you want to be transparent and like, who are you to say, well, these data are going to be misinterpreted by the public and create a distracting narrative? Obviously, he has a bias towards not wanting a negative narrative out there about himself. However, I've been in that sort of circumstance. Just to kind of like, comment on that a little bit, the way I go about it myself, and we'll never know if he's going to go about it the same way, but prior to getting a test, I decide a priori, is this something I am going to divulge publicly? Rather than determining it after the results of the test. So for example, there are some tests that are completely exploratory, and like you don't know if they're going to have any relevance. So for example, a polygenetic risk score for like lipid levels. And if it's like proprietary information on an algorithm that's constantly changing, and I just kind of want to like vet it on myself, and also is taken from a population that does not represent me and my phenotype, then I might decide a priori, look, this is not information I'm going to put out, but just take it for my purposes, rather than be like, I'm going to get the test, and then if I like it, publish the results. So that's just like a personal intellectual integrity thing. I don't know what he does. Long story short, I don't make too much of absence of other thyroid markers, although I think on balance, it would be smart for him to release them along with his LH-FSH. Just like, these are basic things. I don't think it's going to have any negative impact, really. There's not much that I can imagine coming out that would be of pertinence, or let's say could be really used as ammunition against him, other than maybe, evidence that he's using exogenous testosterone. But even then, it's like, you could justify that. So I can't see any real reason for not disclosing that information, personally.
I guess I guess it would just be like him contradicting himself, because he said he's not taking exogenous.
Yeah, that would be the crap. Well, if he lied, that's a problem. Like, that's not good for his brand. So let's assume he's not, like, you kind of have to make that assumption. And if he is, he could dispel the accusation that he's lying very easily. And assuming he's not lying, I don't know why he wouldn't do that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm seeing your point is kind of maybe he has a rationale for not showing. So let's say, his goal is longevity. And so maybe let's speculate. I'm just being totally hypothetical. It's like, maybe he's not showing other markers of thyroid because they're not like perfect and they don't look like stellar on paper. But as far as his team is concerned, that is fine, because it's part of the plan and is part of the plan to achieve longevity. But then he's kind of at the same time trying to say, I am the healthiest person on the planet. So I think this is where all the this is where I've started to become really extra scrutinizing. It's like, okay, if you're going to make a claim and say there's no one else on the planet with as good biomarkers on me, it's like, okay, what else is there? Like,
Right. Well, he has to situate it in the context. Like, how are you defining healthy? Like, fitness is defined by context and what your objective is. So he's not the strongest man in the world. He's not the fastest man in the world. He's trying to say he has biomarkers optimized for longevity. That is the claim. And if that is the claim, you don't need the best thyroid markers. You don't need the highest testosterone. You don't need to be the strongest. Like, his leg press, I guess, is impressive, but it's actually not that relevant. You know what I mean? Like, there are like massive, like, strong men who can lift a ton. Guess what? They generally die pretty freaking young. So I think he needs to be more, like, with respect to his biomarkers, they're specific to his goal.
mm-hmm.
And I think that should be the focus of the conversation rather than trying to say across the board, I'm, quote, optimized, because optimized to what end?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like, you could have a suppressed testosterone. That doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily bad depending on your goal. Or let's say not suppressed, but not 900. If his testosterone was 500, like, for his goals, I'm like, all right, what would you do? Even if he was like subclinically hypothyroid, I wouldn't say that's necessarily bad for his goals. But what his team, if they're back to his team and if they're scientifically rigorous, what they should be able to do is rigorously defend against attacks, saying, look, these markers don't look, quote, perfect by standard metrics. However, they make sense in Bryan's context. So if you speak to any decent endocrinologist, one of the first things they tell you in endocrinology 101 is there's no normal marker. There's only appropriately high or appropriately low. So to give you an example, like when you get a lab report back, right, generally it's a reference range. And if you're in that reference range, you're in the black. And if you're outside the reference range, the number will be red. So you're in the red, right? But it's very context dependent. So for example, let's talk about the hormone, parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone helps defend your blood calcium. So if you go hypocalcemic and your calcium's low, parathyroid hormone should release to like release some calcium from your bone. By contrast, if the calcium is very, very high for whatever reason, your PTH should be suppressed because you don't want to be releasing more calcium. So if you're hypercalcemic, calcium is very high, then what you should want or what you should expect is the PTH to be low in the red, and then you say it's appropriately suppressed. If it were normal in the reference range, then you say this is inappropriately normal. Hopefully that makes sense to people. And the reason I bring this up is because in interpreting Bryan's biomarkers, he might have some things that are, appropriately low, and maybe his testosterone taken in this context is inappropriately high or inappropriately normal. I'm not saying it actually is, but I'm saying like that's the way one should think about Bryan's biomarkers. And I have not seen that perspective articulated. I think being completely transparent about all the biomarkers he has, and then have his team of physicians and scientists do a breakdown of why these biomarkers make sense for Bryan's goals. Seems reasonable, right?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I'm coming at this with like I'm trying to put out these criticisms and be critical of him to hopefully kind of like squeeze out some more nuance from him. Because when you when you analyze the marketing for his products, it's just very, very clear that the marketing is basically, here's the Bryan Johnson story. It's very captivating. Bryan is now the healthiest person on the planet. Wouldn't you want to be the healthiest person on the planet? So why don't you buy Blueprint Bryan Johnson products so you can be like Bryan Johnson? And so then that is kind of why I become critical of these I am the healthiest person on the planet claims. And then how do I justify that? Well, I'm the healthiest person on the planet because I have the best comprehensive biomarkers on the planet. And so it's kind of like, do you want to buy bodybuilding supplements from Chris Bumstead or the guy who placed like 10th or something? Of course, you want to buy it from Chris Bumstead. And so I guess that's why I'm coming at with like, okay, if you're going to say you have the best biomarkers on the planet, then like, let's see them. And then that's a very good point that you made. It's like, what is the context for these different numbers and what is the goal that you're trying to achieve to be able to say that these are the best biomarkers in terms of achieving that particular goal?
I guess the question to him is like, how do you want to be perceived? If your goal is to capture the most members of the general public and have the best branding for your product and make the most money, then the hyperbolic claims kind of make sense. It's almost, forgive the analogy, but kind of Trumpian. Like, people are entertained by Donald Trump and his extreme claims, but they kind of know not to take him literally most of the time. And I don't know if Bryan Johnson wants to be that person, or if he wants to have a brand that is, let's say, cloaked in more scientific rigor, which I think is achievable for him, which is why I think we're both trying to push him a little bit. And to his credit, the way I see him talk in long form podcasts about being a scientific communicator is quite reflective, saying that he's going to make mistakes and he wants to learn how to communicate better. I think it's a journey we're all on. So I don't knock him for not being perfect by any means. But if he's serious about growth, then he should be able to parse what are trolley comments, because he said, oh, I'm always going to get ripped apart, which to some degree is true. There's always going to be like 20% of people who are just going to attack you. But what are also like legitimate criticisms from people that are having an elevated discussion, like I think we are right now. So, I'm interested to see if he actually engages with some of the ideas that we put forth, because I think they are to his long-term benefit if I do understand his goals, which are, to really promote Do Not Die and, amplify it through perceived scientific rigor. Hopefully to match the actual scientific rigor that goes on the back end, but we just don't know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it would be super interesting to see a podcast between you and him, or you and him and his team. That'd be really refreshing. What do you think?
I can think of quite a few people who would be up for a roundtable with Bryan.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to see that. What do you think about these speed of aging tests? Do you feel like that's a pretty useful uh, useful marker to have?
I think it's interesting and exploratory. It's gamification. I think Bryan's fully admits this. I think he and Derek, More Plays More Days, were talking about these different tests and their functionality, because I think Derek had been critical of them. So I'll refer people to that conversation, because I think they probably did a deeper dive and were more read up on the different tests than I am. So, I won't make any strong claims. I would say I think probably they're interesting, but they're not like validated. They're not like validated against whether or not you're going to die any later. I mean, the whole thing about like chronological versus biological age is only useful insofar as it would predict your death. And like, if you were 80, let's just hypothetically, with a test that returns a biological age of 40, I'm not super confident that you're actually going to live to be 120, 130. We'll find out. But like, the tests are a little bit, they're gamification, they're exploratory. I won't take them literally, but I think they're interesting. I do think it's fair game for Bryan to have whatever his like rejuvenation Olympics with the speed of aging tests. If things are decided a priori, like this is the test we're going to use and we're just going to share the results. I understand maybe you have some, questions about whether or not rules get changed after the fact to fit the narrative, but I think they're exploratory, interesting. I think they're fair game. They're just not associated with hard outcomes.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think then with the criticisms with that, again, with from my side, becomes kind of the messaging around it. I mean, he said in the Diary of a CEO podcast that everyone needs to know three things, and one of them is they need to know their speed of aging. He said on Flagrant, like pretty soon everyone's going to know their speed of aging, and he's like constantly bragging about this speed of aging thing, and he'll say this means that I age. I age.
His birthday every something like two. He said like I have a birthday every whatever years.
Yeah, every 21 months, something like that.
It's cute. I think it's like one of those things where it's so obviously an extrapolation, not to be taken literally, that I wouldn't criticize him for it, because you get that he's just trying to drive home by analogy what this test means, just reframing it. So I don't think it's a big deal. For what it's worth, talking about disclosing things a priori, I think one of the other things he wanted everybody to know, at least the 50% of the population, is their nighttime erections. If he wants to send me one of those devices, I will say right now, a priori, I will disclose my own results and see how I match up to Bryan. Granted, I'm younger, but I'm down. I'm down to have some fun. Like, I don't mind that, like, transparent trolliness. I think it's kind of fun. I've done that kind of thing before myself. Not that exact test, but like, I think it's fun to make yourself the n=1 model and disclose information about yourself. Like, I get that. So yeah, no, if he wants to send me a dick ring, I'll measure my nighttime erections and I'll post the average from my first week of wearing.
Sure, you could do an n=1. What happens after 720 eggs? How
Oh
does it?
yeah, does it increase? Does my high cholesterol impact my blood flow, or what other things can I do to increase vasodilation down there? So yeah, no, it's fun. I like data.
Yeah,
Hopefully,
I think he has done a very good job with these kind of quirky things and like nighttime erections and speed of aging and stuff. He's very good at telling his story that engages well with people on social media, and it has done a lot of good. People are at least talking more about health, talking more about longevity.
mhm. Yeah, I agree.
Right. Let me just double check if there's anything else I was going to ask you. What else would you tennis? Oh yeah, okay. So you don't. I guess the lack of ApoB, like is ApoB pretty big one? It's not really. Okay.
What was his LDL again?
The LDL-C is 45 milligrams per deciliter.
There's no way his ApoB's elevated at those levels. Like, it's
Okay.
just not, yeah, no. I don't know why he didn't disclose it. It's going to be low. Is he on a pharmacotherapy?
Say again?
Hmm?
Is it,
Is he on lipid lowering medications?
I think it's on atorvastatin. I know it's a statin, and I'm pretty sure it was specifically atorvastatin. He said on.
Huh. I wonder why he wouldn't be on Crestor or Suvastatin. If Brian, if you're listening to this and you are on atorvastatin, I want to know the rationale for that statin in particular, and whether or not he has thoughts on its impact on mitochondrial health. Because there are some questions and concerns. Data that even at very low levels, it can impair complex 4 activity, up to 50% impaired complex 4 activity at nanomolar levels, even in asymptomatic people. So I don't know what his lipids run normally, but if his CAC is 0, if his CAC truly is 0, I'd like to hear his team's rationale for why he's on statin therapy. Where's the data to say that it's going to benefit him for primary prevention with a CAC of 0? And what are the consequences? Like, what is their cost benefit analysis? If they can have a good rationale, then fine. But if you want to do that would be a good litmus test. Actually, I would love to see a thread. This is what I'm going to ask. I have a lot of asks for Brian. Let's start with this one, and it would get him good attention too. If your CAC is 0, why are you taking the statin you're taking? Please post a thread on the risk benefit analysis that your team has done. Fair enough.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Do you think in the More Place, More Dates podcast, Derek was asking him, why aren't you on a PCSK9 inhibitor? Like, as if he should be on one. Would you, we don't know the rationale behind why he's taking a statin, but do you think that would be a preferable thing to be on?
So that's another thing is Brian said, I think, and it was in that podcast that he doesn't do things that have a high risk profile, right? He said his team doesn't do things that he would consider risky. The thing with PCSK9 is they haven't been studied really for long-term use. So if you look at some of the Mendelian randomization studies, which people lean on pretty heavily to make claims about causality for LDL, there's actually data that hazards ratio for Alzheimer's disease is increased by 2.3. The HR is 2.3 for PCSK9 use. This is, again, based on Mendelian randomization, not like, quote, hard data. But in the area of we don't know the long-term consequences, why would you smash your LDL down from 40 if your CAC is 0 with a drug that could increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease if longevity is your goal? So no, I don't think you should be on a PCSK9 inhibitor in this context.
Okay, I see. Okay, so
I don't think he's probably weighing those data. I could share with him the forest plot. I could share with him the data. I don't know that his team is actually, that's their rationale. But if I were in his shoes, that would be my rationale. There's no data to say that it would help him. it could possibly hurt him. So why would he do it?
Right. Okay. So in terms of, I'm just kind of curious. This is just for me, but in terms of ranking, you would say Crestor is better than atorvastatin is better than a PCSK9 inhibitor?
Yeah, but also I don't think he needs lipid lowering medication if his CAC is zero. And also one could say, okay, well, there's potential problems with statins. They can have negative consequences. That's basically undeniable. Also, if his diet is, he said 50% of his calories come from olive oil. So he's on a relatively high fat diet for his intake. Why wouldn't he take his ezetimibe, which just blocks absorption? And he probably has pretty high enterohepatic circulation of cholesterol because he's eating what 50% olive oil. So he could avoid both, take his ezetimibe, probably have his LDL around like 60. And if his CAC is zero, like again, the data for primary prevention for lipid lowering medications in people with CAC of zero suggests basically no benefit for the most part on the population level. So I don't know why he's on lipid lowering medications. And bear in mind, given my position as a PhD scientist but medical student, I will be pretty careful about the claims I make. I wouldn't make that claim if I hadn't heard it stated by many experts in cardiovascular imaging. So I don't get the rationale for his lipid lowering medication choices. I'd like to hear more from him, and that I think will be a great litmus test of him and his team and their rigor in terms of their approach to his profile. Also, bear in mind, I guess what they're probably going to do is cite a lot of large scale data on a population that is metabolically unhealthy, which probably shouldn't, you know, be extrapolated to Bryan because statins have pleiotropic effects. So, in somebody who's really metabolically challenged, if they're reducing inflammation, okay, but Bryan's inflammation markers presumably aren't through the roof. So, how do you weigh that in his particular context? I'd like to hear more.
Okay, so in this particular context of CAC is zero, it doesn't really make that much sense to be driving your LDL-C down to 45 with a statin.
For his end goal of longevity, including, cognitive longevity, probably optimizing mitochondrial health, I wouldn't if I were him. Now, maybe his team knows things that I don't. Fair enough. I'd like to hear them come out and talk about it, or him communicate it via his team. So one could have an open, this, like if we had a roundtable, this is an open discussion we could have. I am not a cardiologist. So or a lipidologist. I mean, I know a decent amount about the literature given what I've studied, but I will just presenting my arguments. People can determine whether or not they make sense to them, and then match them up against whatever Bryan and his team say.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I can tell that I'm a lot more willing to be critical of him than you are. But one of the things that, or I would say you're very nuanced with your critical and very have a lot of prefacing. But what I was going to say is basically one of the concerns with saying I have the best biomarkers on the planet and then posting all this is then people might think, oh, those are the best biomarkers on the planet. I should try and emulate that. And so then they say oh, okay, well, I have a CAC score of 0, but then my LDL-C is 100. I need to lower that down so I can be more like Bryan. That's kind of, maybe I'm not I should be giving more credit to the people who would take this seriously enough to try and mimic it. But that was kind of
I think people that are going to try that are actually following along are probably educated enough to make a little bit more nuanced decisions. By analogy, to kind of put the spotlight on myself, I knew when I did Oreo versus statin and used Oreo to lower my cholesterol, actually probably more potently than his statins are lowering his cholesterol. I knew people wouldn't be stupid enough to be like, well, Oreos are health food. Nick did it, so I should do it. It's okay, you had to assume some level, and that was a lot more extreme. I think that's fair on my end to say, okay, people aren't going to replicate this for health purposes. I'll actually just say as an aside, physicians even who are lean mass hyperresponders have replicated it with Oreos. So there's multiple people doing it out there, but generally they're medically trained.
very cool.
I don't take issue with it. Again, I don't think the point you're making is unfair, But you just said like that I'm what kinder to Bryan. It's not so much that, it's that I want to be very deliberate in where I poke him because I want him to hear me as reasonable. So where I press, I don't want it to be like, what I consider maybe a delusional attack. But look, I want everybody to hear the conversation we just had and say every point that Nick pushed Bryan on was totally reasonable and Bryan should step up. So my goal is to be very clear. I'm not trying to troll him. I'm trying to push him to be better. And every direct ask and criticism I made, I really think, I mean, a biased think is reasonable, but I think it's reasonable. And I hope he agrees. That was my goal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like you kind of want to like, let's only stick with the best criticisms or the ones that are really worth digging down into and having a conversation on, right? Yeah, totally. And then one other thing, just while I have the biomarker sheet up, I was thinking there's not really any dates on this. Wouldn't we want to see when each marker was taken? Like, are all these things taken at the same time?
Mhm.
Is that a fair criticism, or could some?
I think that's fair, and I'd also want multiple data points. Like the thing I mentioned about the TSH. Is that a single 0.5? Is it always 0.5? Has it been 0.5 for the last year? And I do think that's interesting because these markers can have high variability. Depending on how stressed I am, my testosterone can range from, like when I was on my surgical rotation, it was 400. And then I finished that rotation, it like almost triples. It went to 1100. It was just like different sleep, stress, sexual activity levels. So these markers can be very noisy. And even over the course of the day, they can fluctuate. A lot of like hormones are, released in a pulsatile manner. So you take it, 1 hour to the next, they can vary widely. Again, it's not a huge deal because I don't see any red flags there. But I think he should make, his information on the reference ranges available, and then just post maybe like actually have it as a routine thing. Like, I don't know how often he gets these measured, but if he's getting it measured routinely, he should just every month post the same table, see how it trends. If there are changes, describe them. That's exploratory and interesting. And I'll just also say, from a marketing pitch point of view, there are things that he hasn't measured that would be interesting to measure. I would like him to commit to posting certain results a priori, and then if they don't come out, quote, optimal, I actually think that's an amazing opportunity for him. Because the way I see it is he's doing this experiment where the rules change because his life is always going to be changing. So if something comes back not optimal, he has the opportunity to say, hey, look, we identified something not optimal in me, and now we're going to target it. And then he gets it to optimal. And he furthers this idea that he's doing this open scientific experiment. It's not about being perfect at every single time point. It's continuing to optimize and doing that N=1 transparent journey that I think is a real powerful marketing tool. So I think there's actually not much risk in releasing things that, even for his goals might not be optimal, because then he gets to prove to people that he can fix them in a scientific manner, an N=1 scientific manner. I think it'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think about 3-4 weeks ago, he posted this tweet saying, I'm doing a bunch of hyperbaric oxygen chamber therapy. And I did this huge list of different tests. He listed out the names of all the different tests. And so it's kind of like, okay, where's you clearly finished the protocol. Where is it? So it takes time to formulate a post. I'm just really curious to see that and see where he goes with that. It'd be really neat.
And how do you think people will respond if it went left? Like he was saying in the one podcast, I think it was on More Plates, More Dates, that he took HGH, right? And he would never do it again, that it was terrible. Well, then you get negative data, but that's still data. So you did an experiment and the results weren't what you expected them to be. That is science. Good job. Be transparent about it and then go to the next experiment. Like, I think that's powerful. I think that gives him credibility. It doesn't take away from it.
Right.
If you take that approach.
Yeah, I thought that was and those were kind of the things that, like little points like that were kind of the things that made me really interested and kind of impressed by his approach. So to be clear, I was actually really interested in his story and never really had any reason to want to criticize him until until the red meat thing, and I was like, oh, I'll respond to this his science on this, and then I'll just like leave it be. But then I started digging more, and that's kind of where I am
Yeah.
now. But there was like to reiterate that point, there's a lot to like about his process, or there is a lot to like about his process. Um,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts on the rapamycin thing while we're on that? I remember Matt Caberlain.
On it?
He was on it for a long time, I think about 5 years, and then he posted a Twitter thread kind of explaining the rationale for why he stopped it. And Matt Caberlain was very critical of that. He was saying that the rationale didn't make any sense. I don't. So if you didn't see that, I guess that's not really a good question.
I didn't know. I won't speak to something that I don't feel like I could actually give additional 2 cents on. That might be useful. So I'll defer on that.
Okay, no problem. Great. Okay, then I think that's I think that's it. Or are there any kind of this would be a good question to get your thoughts on the things about his protocol that you do think he's doing properly that are contributing to, say, the 20% of effort we can put into longevity to get 80% of the results. Like, do you have any quick thoughts on that? On like what is going well and that kind of thing?
I mean, stress reduction, good sleep, daily exercise. I'm also a fan of olive oil, so I'll give that to him. I probably eat more olive oil than him because I'm not calorically restricted. So I think I could olive oil him under the table. But yeah, I mean, the basics. I love digging into the physiology, you know that. But at the end of the day, practically for people, I think a lot of the time digging into the details is one, because it's fun. Two, maybe benefits the people at the upper echelon who are going to kind of like try to tune things. But then three, like Brian's doing, it just gets people enthusiastic and engaged about metabolic health and their health. So even if they don't do every single biohack, it makes them reflective so that they start doing the basics like sleep, stress reduction, exercise. With respect to longevity, I think a pattern that a lot of people will probably agree on is that when you look at like centenarians and the oldest people alive, the unifying factor is never like a dietary component. It's always social connection and a sense of purpose.
Mhm.
Usually they joke around like, what's the secret to longevity? And they'll be like, smoking and cake or like bacon. Because once a 116-year-old woman's like, I eat bacon every day. Now, whether or not bacon's good for longevity, it's like, look, honestly, diet isn't that big a lever as compared to probably genetics, social engagement, um, purpose, and just luck, quite honestly. So, diet's important for other reasons, but for all the like fine tuning it, like if your nighttime erections are 3.5 hours versus 2 hours, 50 minutes, I don't think it's gonna, transform you into a Greenland shark or a Galapagos tortoise of longevity or something. So, my 2 cents.
Cool,
But
very
what do
good.
I know? Nine. I was on a podcast the other day. They're like, so for men over 30, what are your top three tips? And my third tip was like, don't take advice from a 29-year-old about health over 30.
I,
So for what it's worth.
I was gonna say, as a closing question, I'm sure a bunch of people would be like, "What did he do to get his testosterone over 1,000? Do you do
Mine,
anything?"
I'm young. You want candidness because I have like I don't know if this is the reason,
Mhm.
but I had recently started a new relationship, and it was some of the best sex I've ever had in my life. And I was very ramped up. Now, there's not literature on this is like limitations of literature on good literature on like sex actually increasing testosterone. But bear in mind, like to do that kind of study, you'd also want to do like quality control. And how are you going to control for like the quality of sex? You know what I mean? Or like how are you transitioning? So there are many confounding variables in my life. I have no idea. I just remember there was a time point where it just like rocketed up. But I'm also a guy in my 20s. Having a testosterone of 1,000 isn't like astronomical. I mean, it's fine. I'm
Hmm.
not as stressed right now in my life. Like I'm a 29-year-old guy. I think that's the answer.
Interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting that you said that about stress. Just one anecdote for me. I think I shared that data with you where I did that a 5 day fast and then a marathon, and I dropped my
Yeah.
testosterone to 750 points. So it was like, and my cortisol went up. I can't remember what it was. It was like 40, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly. So, makes sense.
That is a stress.
Yeah,
Yeah.
quite
I'm
the
sure.
stress.
Yeah, no, there's a lot we don't understand about sex steroid regulation. But yeah, no, that's my answer. I'm a 29-year-old guy. If you're a 29-year-old guy and not too stressed as compared to what you were before, then your testosterone will probably be decent.
Great. Awesome. Cool. Nick, I think that was about it. Thanks. These are really good points.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. All right, man. Have a good night. Some
Thank
sleep.
you. Appreciate it, Nick.
Bye bye.
Good.